Green Bay Packers are up next. They start with Lucas Van Ness, pick 13 that they got from the New York Jets. Tight end Luke Musgrave out of Oregon State. They go Jaden Reed, the wide receiver out of Michigan State, in the second round. They double up at tight end. A common Packers move. Tucker Kraft, the tight end out of South Dakota State, in round 3. And then day 3 was just loaded with picks. Colby Wooden, edge out of Auburn. Sean Clifford, the QB out of Penn State. I did not expect him to get drafted. Dontavian Wicks. Some people had Wicks as one of their top receivers. Look at him going in the 5th round. What was the NFL missing there? Carl Brooks, the edge. We have him as a defensive tackle, but he's an edge in Sam's mind from Bowling Green. He is 300 pounds, so he should be a defensive tackle.
He will be a defensive tackle, but he was an edge and should remain an edge because he's really good there.
And the other two very interesting picks in round 7. Anthony Johnson Jr., some people's first-round safety out of Iowa State.
Some people's.
And Grant Dubose, wide receiver out of Charlotte.
Can't quietly very call cryptic. Out the boss. He was on the show and he listens.
Chris loved Anthony Johnson Jr., the safety out of Iowa State. I was a little concerned that Chris would never get to see Anthony Johnson play football unless it was like the Hall of Fame game or something where he was, an undrafted, but he's a 7th rounder that can make this team in Green Bay.
Ben Fennell on Twitter thinks he could start. I mean, a 7th rounder that could end up replacing Adrian Amos and start for them.
I can't wait till Chris is sitting there. It's December. It's Green Bay. He's got the sweater look going because it's freezing there, right?
The quarter zip.
It's the quarter zip going, and it's like, there he is. There's my guy, Anthony Johnson. Starting safety for the Packers.
Single tear rolls down his eye, just pride,
Yeah. Eat that, NFL. Look at him now. Look at him now. What did you think of the Packers draft, Sam?
Yeah, an interesting draft. So I didn't love Lucas Van Ness, the player generally. So obviously I'm not going to be as wild on that one. But they needed receivers across the board. Their 3 next picks were all receivers of some description, 2 tight ends and Jaden Reed, the wide receiver. I think that's good. I like that strategy of doubling up when you have a big need. Try and maximize your capacity to actually hit. Luke Musgrave, a lot of people seem to sour on him as the process went on. I'm not quite sure why. I mean, I think he's got the ability, the talent, the athleticism. Obviously, the sample size is pretty small because he only lasted a couple of games last year before getting hurt. But, I mean, he looked like he could be an impact receiver. Tucker Kraft has really good athleticism, can at least double your chances that one of those guys hits. And then some of the day 3 picks I think are fascinating. Like Carl Brooks, one of my favorite players in the entire draft. That guy's PFF grades, the production of Bowling Green were nuts. He had 61 pressures last season, I think, pass rush. Win rates of 23%, something crazy like that. One of the most productive players in the entire nation. But he's a 300-pound edge rusher who tested like a hippo. Like his testing numbers were atrocious.
Like a hippo.
They were abysmal. Let me call up his thing, you therefore don't know what to do with him. Like a 300-pound edge rusher doesn't work, so he's going to have to play inside at some capacity. And then what does that look like if you have zero athleticism profile to bring to the table? Okay, measurables. 40-yard dash, 6th percentile. 10-yard split, 7th percentile. Vertical jump, 3rd percentile, 27 inches. Broad jump, 7th percentile. The short shuttle, the 1st percentile, a 5-second short shuttle. That's like what the 3-cone, that was his best movement measurable, the 13th percentile, a 7.63 second 3-cone time. I mean, these are catastrophic workout numbers. To the point where you're like, how is this guy even getting drafted? These are non-viable numbers. You cannot function in the NFL with that kind of athletic profile. But his tape is it's really good. And I actually think it's really good on the edge. I think he's a better edge rusher than he was inside. Anytime they moved him inside, he didn't have the same kind of array of moves. He didn't have the same kind of production. He's a good edge rusher somehow, despite being 296, 300 pounds.
Is the 300-pound Carl Brooks better on the edge and the 265, 270-pound Lucas Van Ness better on the interior?
Yes. Almost, unquestionably so, based off the current evidence, in my opinion.
I've given credit to the Chiefs for having all sorts of different body types and multi-gap players and everything. It does seem like the Packers have an interesting crew with that stuff too, right? Rashawn Gary and Van Ness maybe as your starting edges by name, but Preston Smith is still there. Van Ness can move around. Devontae Wyatt's more of an interior penetrator, last year's first-rounder at defensive tackle. But then you add Carl Brooks to the mix as another move-around big body type.
So I asked on Twitter, every year you get these guys with the Kaiir Elam, Christian Benford thing, right? players that are drafted lower than somebody at the same position in the same year by the same team and end up jumping that player?
I have some answers for you too,
on the depth chart.
I got some answers.
Well, I think the Packers, they've got 3 guys that could do it. I mean, the Packers could have Tucker Kraft easily jump Luke Musgrave. That wouldn't be shocking at all. They're vaguely similar in terms of ranking by a lot of people. At wide receiver, they drafted 3 of them: Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks, and Grant Dubose. I really liked Grant Dubose as a day 3 guy. Very sort of raw and new to the position, but has a lot of skills. Wouldn't shock me if he jumped one or both of the guys above him. And crazy as it sounds, I mean, Carl Brooks, I think, is a better edge rusher than Lucas Van Ness right now.
Oh, you're crazy.
Now, who knows where they're going to play? Like, both those guys may end up seeing most of their time inside. And Lucas Van Ness is very new to the position, very inexperienced. He could get an awful lot better. But it wouldn't be crazy if Carl Brooks ended up jumping him early.
I want to go
playing time.
I want to go through the Packers draft history really quick, because this history of doubling up on positions is really fascinating that they've done. I mean, you could go all the way back to 2012, where they drafted Jarrell Worthy, the defensive tackle, in round 2, and then Mike Daniels, the defensive tackle, in round 4. Daniels was the guy that ended up being better. More specifically, though, 2015, they drafted Demarius Randall, safety by name, but they played him at corner. Demarius Randall at corner, and then Quentin Rollins at corner with their first 2 picks, right? And then they come back 2 years later, and they go, or 3 years later, and they go back-to-back corners again. 2018, Jair Alexander and Josh Jackson, both corners. And then they go 3 wide receivers: Jamon Moore, Marquez Valdez-Scantling, and Equinemius St. Brown. In all of these situations, they found one, right? Jair was good, Josh Jackson, not good. Valdez-Scantling was very productive. The other 2 receivers, not so much. They did this again last year with Romeo Doubs in the second, Christian Watson in the second. Now, both of those guys I think are going to prove to be valuable, but they specifically double up at this position of need. And not just positions of need, but positions that are pretty valuable, where they're saying, we're going to take multiple shots at this to find one. We're going to take 2 shots or 3 shots to find one, and it's worked out pretty well for the Packers historically.
And the number of times that it's not the top guy that ends up being the best player of the doubling up process is huge. Like, for everyone that's going to look at this and say, oh, there's no way any of those guys jump the guy ahead of them. Like, obviously there's a reason they're taken below the player that was taken ahead. But the number of times that the second or third player in the double or triple up process jumps the guy ahead of him it's not as small as you would think it is. It happens pretty regularly.
So I'm really interested by that, right? The 2 tight ends, Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft. The thing with Musgrave, he is an interesting prospect because he had no production until 2022. And his 2022 production was 2 games.
Yeah.
And he gets hurt. But he looked really good in those 2 games. 6'6" frame. He moves well. He's a kind of a clunky route runner sometimes, but you can understand where there's some development there, but you see the body and the movement skills, and it's like he can go up and get it. I think between Musgrave and Kraft, you could use both, but you're going to, probably have one of those guys that emerges as a tight end. And Jaden Reed, I think, is more of a change of pace. He can do jet sweep stuff. He's a pretty good route runner. He wins at the catch point. Jaden Reed does a lot of things pretty well at receiver. But, it'll be interesting to see if just Grant Dubose, who was a slick route runner, beat Deontay Banks for a touchdown when they played Maryland, and good body control. And I'm surprised Grant Dubose from Charlotte lasted all the way to the 7th.
Same.
I think the Packers draft might be one of those where you look at the volume. What was it, 12 players, 13 players? Do you find 4 or 5 players out of this? Yeah, they might come from various rounds, though. Look, I think I don't know if Van Ness will ever be a star, but I think he's a good, solid player, kind of an old school 5-tech body that will fit in with the group of pass rushers that they have in Green Bay. Sean Clifford in round 5. He's right there with your DTR from UCLA, like those quarterbacks who start their career with such inconsistency, where you're like, no way these guys ever become prospects. But like DTR got better and better and better, where Clifford was still as maddeningly inconsistent in his final year at Penn State, like year 12, whatever it was. And I was a little surprised to see him go that high.
Yeah.
He's a talented guy. He's a talented quarterback that was just like, mediocre college quarterback.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating the way some teams sometimes value that area of pick. Like, 5th round is still, like, you can get some players in the 5th round, and yet you take a guy that's basically, a total projection.
Just to put a bow on their draft, Anthony Johnson from Iowa State. We were joking about like Chris Collinsworth watched the film and loved him. Yeah. Absolutely loved him.
And isn't alone in that.
Yeah, and other people did too. And I mentioned too, he was a model identifier last year. He had good production at corner.
Model adjacent.
And he was on my watch list this year. But that he converted to safety at Iowa State. He was just far less inconsistent. But the two things I like, it's multiple positions that he's played, been pretty productive. And then he did have one of the fastest pure straight line speed times using our in-game athleticism. So you see a lot of the potential there, but for a 7th round pick where the paths to the field, you have last year of Darnell Savage, we have Rudy Ford, Tariq Carpenter, Tarvarius Moore. I mean, there's paths to the field for 7th round safety Anthony Johnson out of Iowa State where he actually could see some time for the Packers here. So I think the Packers are going to steal some production from 2 or 3 of these day 3 players, and we're going to like this draft over time.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably not going to be the players necessarily that, I individually like or that you individually like, but this looks like the kind of draft which is exactly what you do if you have that many needs, if you need some contributors. Like, you draft a bunch of times, you double up at some positions, and you essentially play the odds, right? Like, this is an acknowledgement of the fact that we're not great at this, that your strike rate might be 30%. But if it's 30%, fine. Draft 3 wide receivers. One of them hits statistically. Draft a couple of tight ends. One of them might hit statistically. Draft a couple of defensive linemen. One of them statistically probably hits. Like, this is what they've done. They needed players at certain positions. They've shotgunned their approach at it. They drafted a bunch of guys they liked, and then they hoped that statistically, by the odds, they're going to get contributors out of each one of those spots and therefore fill their needs.
I'll say of their first 5 picks, I don't have strong feels about any of them. Like any of their first 3 rounders, rounds 1 through 3 there. Van Ness, Musgrave, Jaden Reed, Tucker Kraft, their first 4. I don't have strong feels either way, so don't love, don't hate.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't have wildly.
Jaden Reed did go higher, much higher than expected. I think his consensus board was in the hundreds or so, and he goes at 50.
I think Musgrave at 42 is a solid pick. I think, I like Musgrave, and I like the 2 tight ends the most of their first 4 picks. I think those are good players at solid value at a wildly needy position.
So we go B+ for the Packers over at PFF.com.